All right. Hi, everyone. We will get started here. Today for our 2030 series event, we're discussing daylight and integrated lighting design. Some of the learning objectives, understand relationship between daylight, human health, and energy efficiency. Identify and evaluate daylighting strategies to optimize energy performance and occupant comfort, and also understand techniques for effectively managing glare and unwanted heat gain. As always, we like to thank our chapter sponsors. We couldn't do a lot of the work we do without their support. Again, just as a reminder in terms of, I know with things going on in the world, this is becoming a very hot topic, but the urban built environment is responsible for about 75% of annual greenhouse gas emissions, with buildings accounting for close to 40% of that. So that's a pretty big realm of responsibility we as architects have in terms of doing our part to mitigate the effects of climate change. As we talked about, the 2030 challenge was issued in 2006 with the goal of getting the design and construction industry to meet greenhouse gas reduction thresholds by some certain dates. Currently looking at reducing by 80% from now till 2025, and then stepping up to 90%. And then carbon neutral by 2030, meaning no fossil fuel greenhouse gas emitting energy to operate. Just in terms of signing on to the 2030 commitment, you'd create an account on the Design Data Exchange, have a letter of intent from firm leadership, create a sustainability action plan, and then report on projects to the DDX. And then hopefully many of you are doing this anyways, but conduct lessons learned on past projects. Again, I just love the moonshot quote from JFK. But as I know many of you have been attending these, I won't regurgitate it. So let's go ahead and dive in. All right. I'll open it up to any questions or dialogue folks may have.
Andrew, this is Dennis.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck me was the change that we've seen in materials that we've always had. For instance, in glazing, you know, it used to be when I started in this business, there was glass, and when you specified it, it was the same thing throughout the building. Where today, they mentioned in here, and we've been dealing with that also, is you really have to think about what each piece of glazing is going to be doing, whether it's clearest story or whether it's view. And you have now the options that we didn't used to have in this business of really thinking through that much more in depth. I was glad to note that they mentioned that here.
I think it's interesting too, even to think about, I mean, at that section of the video, I was thinking, yeah, how can performance begin to influence design, and how can that be articulated in design, right? So the 0 to 3 foot space, you know, some buildings I'm working on right now, yeah, it's the sill is about 3 foot. But to then articulate, yeah, the higher portions outside the view, or yeah, even getting into space by space, you know, yeah, there's, you know, bathrooms, yeah, I would agree with what they said in the video. Daylighting bathrooms is a great way to just further enhance human health and the occupancy of the space. But I also don't want a big vision glass at 3 foot to 6 foot in a bathroom. So all of a sudden it something as simple as the glass you're specifying or thinking about in terms of daylight begins to influence interior program, which is kind of fun.
We were just talking about this yesterday at my office about one of the projects I just specified glasses with a VLT of like less than 25%. And you wouldn't do that in a classroom necessarily, but you might do that in a public common space where you have a lot of glazing. So I think that is something to think through more of, where you can tune that glass a little more intently.
I think the one thing I'm interested in terms of some dialogue with this group is obviously for us as architects, we understand a lot of the performance metrics, and even the example you just gave there, Luke. How are you communicating that with clients? Visual light transmittance is for I'm thinking of, say, a school principal, right? It's not entirely fair of me to say they don't know, but they probably think simply about it, just like maybe a homeowner would. Hey, I just want light. Okay, well, VLT of 25%. You're going to get 25% of the amount of light you could get. But it has these other performance factors. So I'm just curious if people are having conversations with owners and how that's going as well.
I do a lot of schools, and I think you're right, Andrew. A lot of administrators really leave it to the architect to determine what's needed and what's not. And I'd sooner say the conversation is generally between the architect and the construction manager relative to cost and benefit. And probably where we engage the owner more is when there is a big disagreement between the cost benefit between the CM and the architect. And that's where you have to spend the time educating the client, if you will, as to the positives and the negatives of your choices.
Yeah, that's a good point. And kind of where my question was heading is, it's, well, how much does it cost? And then whether the owner asks that or the CM prices it and comes back and says, man, this glass package I could reduce by 25%. It's like, okay, well, I think if anything, what it reinforces is probably some of the earlier sessions, having a good owner's program requirements and basis of design in terms of let's set those objectives or goals early. Because yes, to your point, there's a lot of decisions that are left up to us to negotiate with the CM for a multitude of reasons. But I think what I'm thinking is the education ideally happens a lot earlier in the process, at least enough to get an owner to say, here's an objective I have. Because that makes it a lot easier if it does get contentious, or even just, all of a sudden, hey, I can save 25% on this budget. Okay, well, hold on. Before you make that decision, remember this was an objective and this is why we went down that road. So
I think it's much easier to have that conversation early with a client when, for instance, with a higher ed client, because they already have sustainability goals they're striving for. So it's much easier to have that discussion. The K-12, many times, particularly when you're working with smaller, more rural districts, they're already overwhelmed with teaching, so to speak. And so trying to have those conversations early sometimes can be pretty difficult, and it does wind up being later in the process than what you wish it would be.
do you find that the conversation changes so from higher ed to K-12, do you change how you approach the conversation thinking of the same end objective?
Right. Yeah, and again, I think it comes down to I don't know how to really term it, but to the sophistication of the client.
Mhm.
I think, again, the higher, not all, but many higher ed clients already have sustainability on the forefront of their minds when you're working with them. So having that dialogue really becomes more about the benefit and the goals that you're trying to achieve versus when you're working with K-12 clients, many times they haven't even thought about some of these things. So you're bringing it to their attention for the very first time.
Right.
And what you're hoping to do is make it important enough that they want to know more and they eventually will agree with the direction you're giving them. I don't know what other people have found, but that's just been my experience.
I'm curious. It's always one of those things too. I at least try to think about being careful with, but pulling at the heartstrings a little bit, right? So in terms of K-12, it's, hey, the objective is to increase the learning outcomes for your students and the health and
Right.
well-being of the students in your space. So I would probably never actually use an extreme example like this, but we can put a classroom on the interior of the building with no daylight.
Right.
So you saved a lot of money in windows. Or we can put it exterior, oriented properly with good daylight, maybe no artificial lighting at all. So now, and we've increased human health and removed an energy use out of the building. And I don't know that, I mean, that's just me spitballing in terms of also trying to think too about generally clients who may not be that sophisticated and trying to paint the picture of what it's sort of painting the way we're heading or where we want to maybe take it, but also helping get them to realize I'm not just trying to put a bunch of glass in your building because I'm an architect and I like glass. There's some real human impacts to this decision. And, even if it doesn't get to the level of visible light transmittance and what is that, it's more in generalities. Hey, is that an objective? So yeah, I think
Well, to be honest,
these are
in K-12, a lot of times I'll try to push for actual reorganization of an existing school. We do a lot of work, of course, on existing buildings. And so there are many opportunities where you can actually change functions of rooms that are on the exterior with those that are on the interior. And many older schools had a lot of interior classrooms. So one of the things we'll usually try to do is, can we flip some of these things? Can we take some of the functions that aren't used all day long, like a classroom, and maybe move those into the interior versus a classroom that's used for the majority of the school day, try to move that into these exterior walled spaces. Sometimes you're successful, sometimes you're not, because again, it always comes down to budget, but that's certainly one of the avenues we're always looking at.
Mhm. So any other takeaways or comments folks have? Well,
Thank you,
we're coming
thank you
up.
for hosting these. These are good. I've enjoyed them.
Yeah. Thank you all for attending. I know, I think pretty much everyone on the call currently, I think I've seen most of you pretty regularly. So thanks for your interest. So some schedule updates. We'll do our next session next Tuesday. And then I believe it's a week off, a week or two off, and then another session, a week off, and then the final session. As we're getting close to wrapping up, feel free to shoot me emails if me or Pam, and she'll forward them on to me. We're starting to look at programming for 2022 and trying to think of things that are interesting. And so particularly, if there's things we can build upon here and dive a little deeper, we'd love to hear that. And, hopefully generate some interest and more participation around these topics. And I think it's always helpful to ask people that are attending, why are you attending and what more would you like to see? So I guess that'd be some homework I'd offer to everybody for the next week. It'll be the same time next week, 11:30, and hopefully we'll see each other then.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks.